Nigel Biggar is a professor of theology at Oxford, but I think we're going to find out his specialization intersects with these discussions we're having, and perhaps some of the events that have happened here too. Nigel, we welcome you to our fellowship. We're so grateful that you're speaking to us. I think it's probably pretty late in England at the moment. And we look forward very much to what you have to tell us. Thank you.
Hello to everybody. I'm sorry we can't meet in the flesh, but I count it a privilege to intrude on your fellowship and look forward to the conversation we're going to have. Hope that you'll benefit from it and perhaps feel encouraged by it at the end.
Thank you, Nigel. Yeah, and as Oliver mentioned, it is rather late in Oxford, so thank you for staying up and addressing us this morning. So yeah, wonderful that we can have you. Hardly intruding. It's a privilege that you're with us. Perhaps first off, I mean, Oliver mentioned briefly that you're a professor of theology, but in fact, your title is much longer than that. Could you tell us a little bit about your own personal upbringing and also perhaps a bit about your professional background and interests?
Yes, Peter. So I'll just launch in response to that question. If I miss anything out, then feel free to prompt me. So I'm 67. I was born in southwest Scotland to a Scottish father, English mother. At the age of 13, I went south to England to boarding school, where I lost my Scottish accent within 2 months. I began at the back of the scrum shouting push, push in September and was shouting push, push by December. I went from my school in Bath to Oxford University, where I now am, to study history in the early 1970s. I then went to Canada and eventually the US to study theology. I met my American wife in Canada, brought her back to this country in 1985, where we've been based ever since, apart from a short sojourn in the Republic of Ireland in the early noughties. Since 2007, I have occupied the Regius Chair of Moral and Pastoral Theology at the University of Oxford. If you're curious about the word Regius, it's just Latin for royal, and historically, my chair, along with a number of others in the UK, are formally by royal appointment. And I was in the Regius Chair for 15 years until I retired 2 weeks ago. So you see a demob happy ex-professor or professor emeritus. Now, moral theology, not everyone understands what that is. Otherwise interpreted, it means Christian ethics, in effect. I'm an ethicist. I'm a Christian theologian, but I specialize in ethics. Because of the nature of ethics, I also cross the border into moral philosophy. And I've done work on the ethics of euthanasia, of war, of nationhood, of rights, and just today I sent off the index to a book on colonialism that will come out next February.
Well, maybe yeah, very good. Maybe just picking up on that book that you've just writing. So I also understand you direct a work on the theme of empire. Can you just briefly explain about that as well?
Yes, 5 years ago, about probably 6 years ago, in 2016, I discerned that the topic of empire, I thought it was really quite a culturally strategic topic. I happen to, although I'm a theologian and I've been doing theology and philosophy for decades, my first love was always history, and I've spent probably 25 years reading, among other things, British imperial history. So I know a thing or two about it. And I just discerned that the issue of empire was culturally quite a strategic one. And I got in touch with a very eminent historian of empire here in Oxford, John Darwin, and together we cooked up and launched a project under the title of Ethics in Empire, which was actually designed to look at empire from ancient China to modern European empires, and to consider what people at the time, what the ancient Chinese thought about empire, what the medieval Muslims thought about empire, and to track what they thought ethically, and just to get some distance from current cultural wars about colonialism, to see how in the past people have thought about the phenomenon of empire and colonial political organization. So we launched that in July 2017, and it's still going. We're going to have our final meeting next year.
Mm-hmm. So how do you see that intersecting with more broadly your background in morality and ethics, etc.? So you're seeing that you're using that background to analyze the history of empires, essentially. Is that right?
Yeah, in moral terms, that's right. That's right.
Okay.
So I mean, I think when I first began to tell people I was launching this project, I think most of my friends thought it was slightly daft. I mean, why empire? And I think I wasn't brought up as a Christian. I became a Christian. I'm now, as it happens, an Anglican priest. But I've also recently owned up to being a British patriot. It's something all my life that's been rather unfashionable, but I've, as I say, I've been immersed in British history, British imperial history, and part of, I think, my personal motive in studying such a thing was actually to put myself in a position of being able to tell the whole truth about that part of my own country's past, and of course it's part of your country's past too. The whole truth, not just what I perceive to be, and I think I would think this, wouldn't I? What I perceive to be the rather partisan story that is dominating the airwaves right now.
Well, maybe we should just pick up on that. So you're doing this research, and one might ordinarily think it's quite benign in a sense. It's a fascinating topic, but as you've already indicated, these words aren't particularly fashionable at the moment, empire or colonialism. So why do you think they've fallen out of favor?
It's a very good question, Peter, and I've not found any thoroughly satisfying answer to that. It is important to be aware that the climate that prevails now is not what prevailed 20 years ago. So there's a generational thing going on. You'll find a previous generation of historians with a much more balanced and even-handed view of things imperial. But we have a younger generation of historians who are, on the whole, filled with anti-colonial zeal. Now, why has that come about? This is speculation. Part of me thinks that the kind of dry clinical study of history proved morally unsatisfying to lots of folk, and so, you know, as an ethicist, as a Christian, I can't complain about people being morally engaged with things, with historical things. I am too. So partly there's been a turn to moral and political engagement with academic history, but to my mind, the engagement is too unbalanced. Now, why they unbalance, I don't quite know, except that I think I presume to think that we all know the pleasures of riding a moral high horse. It's great to be amongst the righteous, and it's great it feels great to cast down the unrighteous. So self-righteousness and being on a moral crusade is a human temptation, always has been. I certainly speak for myself. I'm often tempted to it. So there is a kind of moral, spiritual temptation there, and lots of people giving into it. So I think it's partly that. But then I suspect social media too sort of amplifies certain forms of zealotry and gives the impression that what is the obsession of a minority is actually much more widely held than is in fact the case. If you add to that the fact that certainly in Britain and amongst most academics who are not specialist historians, most people know very little about the imperial and colonial past except what they read in the newspapers. And if they read left-wing newspapers, they will get a very, very, right now, a very distorted view. So, and therefore those people are susceptible to other colleagues who are more zealous and more convinced. And of course, everyone understands that to be suspected of being racist is damaging to reputation and maybe even to friendship. So people who are not certain and don't know much fall silent and acquiesce in what appears to be a dominant point of view.
And does it come across to you, as it quite possibly does to many men on this call, that this change has come very rapidly? Does it feel that way to you? Yes,
it does. I mean, perhaps we'll talk about it in a moment, but I fell into the controversy completely by accident and inadvertently in December 2017. I had no idea what was coming. And yes, I mean, 10 years ago, I would never have imagined we'd be where we are now, even 5 years ago. And quite why it has happened so rapidly is a puzzle. I mean, I guess I've explained it partly in terms of social media, partly in terms of the amplification of the zeal of a minority and the uncertainty of a majority. Certainly in the UK, it does seem as if most of our cultural institutions have completely fallen to the zeitgeist through a combination, I think, of ignorance, terror of being thought on the wrong side of history, perhaps not an excess of moral courage, all those things.
Yeah. Well, let's do go to those events of 5 years ago. I know they're not necessarily pleasant to recall, but you did fall foul of the thinking that you're describing. Can you please elaborate a little on how that all unfolded for you?
Yeah, so as I said, we launched the Ethics and Empire project, which takes the form of a series of closed conferences, closed because they're workshops, they're not really for sort of public consumption at this point, in July 2017. In November 2017, I wrote an article in the London Times making what I thought was the completely anodyne, incontrovertible argument that we British have cause for pride as well as shame in our imperial past. Pride as well as shame, not just the one, both. I thought to myself, who could possibly disagree with that? And then about a week later, I finally got round, after dithering for 3 months, to posting online an account of the Ethics and Empire project. And my wife and I always go to some European city for a city break to celebrate our wedding anniversary in December. And there we were in Heathrow Airport waiting to board a flight to Germany. And I got, as others may know, it's quite hard to resist checking one's email just one last time before you board an aeroplane, which I did. And there was a message from the Public Affairs Directorate of Oxford University alerting me to the fact that my project had become the target of an online protest by a group of Oxford students. And then that was on a Thursday. On a Saturday, my eminent historian colleague sent me an email urging me to dissociate the project from a defense of the British Empire, which puzzled me because, as the description online made plain, the Ethics and Empire project was nothing to do with the defense of the British Empire. So I wondered why I had to dissociate it. On the following day, he abruptly resigned from the project. The following Tuesday, I think, a second online protest was published, this time from 58 Oxford colleagues. And then on the Thursday was a third one, signed by 170 or so academics worldwide, addressed to my university and, in effect, urging the university to pull its support for the project.
Mm. Did these critiques at all engage with the substance of what you were saying?
The last one didn't. I mean, the truth is, up to that point, Peter, I hadn't said very much. I mean, we're talking about an 800-word article. I had, in fact, published a book on the ethic of the nation, the last chapter, which was my first treatment of things imperial in terms of New Testament scholarship. That had come out in 2014, but no one knew about that. I mean, what seemed to irk these protesters was, I guess, the fact that I seemed not to think that empire was intrinsically wicked. Mm. Although the second protest from 58 Oxford colleagues seemed to think that talking in terms of empire as good or evil was something that naive theologians might do, but we historians, it said, were too sophisticated for that. Except that, of course, their protest was rife with moral assumptions that, not being ethicists, they were completely oblivious to. So there was a strange paradox there. So, but there wasn't. I mean, my consistent experience of the what I'll call the anti-colonialist critics is that they don't really engage carefully with what I say. They prefer to resort to ad personam attacks. They distort what I say in order to knock it down. And they're not actually a very good argument. They're quite good at rhetoric, not so good at argument. So the answer to your question is they didn't really engage, not in the kind of rigorous giving and taking of reasons that you would expect of professors at a university, particularly a university like Oxford.
So all this is happening while you're on your holiday celebrating your anniversary.
Yes.
Yeah, what sort of impact did it have on you and your wife?
Well, you need to remember, I then was a naive, gentle, mild-mannered academic, unaccustomed. You know, if I was a political bruiser or a businessman, I might be used to this kind of thing, but I wasn't. I was accustomed to engaging in civil, rational give and take of reasons, which might be robustly critical, but it was civil. And this kind of behavior completely took me by surprise. I mean, the root of the campaign went back to a professor of post-colonial literature in Cambridge University, and I know this because I photographed her tweets when she read. She tweeted in early December in relation to the Ethics and Empire project. OMG, oh my God, this is serious, SHIT. We must block capitals shut this down. And you know, this wasn't this was not exactly an invitation to conversation. It was an act of political repression, and I had no idea really how to respond to it. In those days, I used to think I was morally obliged to respond to anyone who addressed me as obliged to respond as rationally as possible. But I did learn that trying to engage in a rational conversation with people who don't want a rational conversation is actually not very fruitful, and is a recipe for getting extremely frustrated. But no, so it was unnerving, it was frustrating, it was dismaying, it was bewildering. I did lose sleep over it, because my name was in the newspapers in the UK every day until the end of the month. I can't remember the chronology, but my name ended up being in the German press, the Danish press, Italian press. I think the row even reached India. I ended up on a radio program in South Africa.
So you lost sleep, but it sounds like you also lost friends. You certainly lost your colleague. What was the reaction?
Yeah, and also there was another very close old friend who advised me to drop the project because it was quote unquote toxic, and I didn't, and he resigned from the advisor council of the research center I run. Yes, and yeah, I lost some friends and colleagues. Others were striking in their silence. I mean, I had some people out of the blue write to me in support. Some people were within my own university, but what was odd was how many of my colleagues, some of whom are friends, said nothing. Yeah,
comes back to that question of courage you mentioned at the outset.
Yes, and people, I think, are fear of contagion, and terribly fearful of being associated with someone who is regarded as being suspect. I myself, I guess, I don't know, I'm just clearly become the kind of person who doesn't really care so much about that, and I don't quite understand people who are quite so nervous about it. But I guess many people, I think, just don't know how to deal with conflict.
So you obviously found the strength somehow to persist despite people falling away from you or remaining silent. Yeah, so how do you think, how did that come about? How did you find that strength to carry on?
That's a really good and important question. You know, it's a number of things, Peter. I think in my teenage life and my early 20s, I was involved in a family conflict in which I learnt that I had to take risks for the sake of my own psychological and moral integrity. I had to take risks, and that the risks involved saying no, even if important other people rejected me. And I did that certainly with the significant support of my wife, but also I think as a Christian, I think as a Christian, I believe myself to be loved by God, and I believe myself to be duty bound to God. And if you see yourself that way, it does give you a source of strength to do things, even if everybody around you thinks you're crazy. And if you read the Old Testament prophets, I mean, poor old Jeremiah at some point railing against God for making him say things that alienate him from people. I mean, really complaining, why do you make me do this stuff? But then saying, it's a fire in my belly, I can't stop it. But so I think Christian faith helped me there, but certainly my experience of working through a family conflict and deciding that I have to take risks even if I'm isolated, and discovering you can survive that. I think that was really very, very important. And then more broadly, even though you know, in December 2017, I have lots of academic colleagues protesting in public. You know, you notice, first of all, you know, 58 Oxford colleagues initially felt, you know, like a barracking, but then you remember there are in fact 2,000 Oxford colleagues. This is only 58. And then actually, judging by my email correspondence and judging by letters to the newspapers, a lot of people out there in the general public were on my side. And I remember in particular, a palliative care consultant whom I'd met at a conference 15 years ago, not been in touch since, who in fact he's a British Indian, or an Indian Briton. And he wrote to me and said, I don't know if you know, Nigel, but my grandfather was in the Jallianwala Bagh in Amritsar when General Dyer opened fire in April 1919, a famous British military misstep. And he said, but notwithstanding that, I agree with you. I think the British Empire contained good as well as bad. So I discovered actually that a lot of people out there, a lot of people with non-white skins agree with me, not with my predominantly white critics.
And the university itself, what did they do?
In my case, I was very fortunate. From the beginning, I was told that I had the backing of the Vice Chancellor, Louise Richardson, who has been consistently vociferous in asserting free speech and academic freedom in our university. So I was lucky, but I was lucky because certainly in the British context, to my knowledge, she's the only Vice Chancellor I've ever read in newspapers. I mean, every Vice Chancellor does lip service to freedom of speech, but there's always a but at the end of it. With Louise, there was no but. So I was lucky. If I hadn't been here, if I hadn't been quite as senior, if I'd been a junior, more vulnerable colleague, I wouldn't have been able to withstand it. But I was fortunate.
So what, if any, lessons do you think from the critique do you think are worth heeding, though? Are there things about the critique of our past, the Western past, colonialism, etc., that you've been now forced to think through and perhaps even modify your thinking as a result of this experience?
So my initial answer is no, partly because I've been in reactive defensive mode. And I do think that the critique, the anti-colonialist critique, is so unbalanced because according to their story, the British Empire and British colonialism was simply a litany of racism, oppression, exploitation, and slaughter. Now, against that story, well, in that story, I can find very little to sympathize with. But it's partly because I've always been upfront in saying that the British Empire and British colonialism contained bad as well as good. Yes, it contained racism. Yes, it contained unjustifiable violence. Yes, it contained economic exploitation. Yes, it involved slavery for the first half of its life. So I have no trouble admitting those things. It's just that that's half the story. Yes, we did slavery from 1650 to 1807, but then we suppressed slavery all over the world for the second half of the empire. Yes, the empire contained some appalling racial prejudice, on the other hand, the abolition of slavery was based on the Christian conviction of the basic human equality of all races under God. The very least you can say is that the empire was morally ambiguous. But I've no trouble. I've no trouble admitting the evils that the empire contained, as any long-standing political organization would contain, because this is a sinful world where even good people sin. Mm-hmm. I speak as a Christian, but I suppose actually, if I stop reacting, I mean, the one thing I am aware of is the way in which non-white peoples, in the face of Western dominance, can feel humiliated, and anyone who's been humiliated is prone to resentment. So I get that, but I do think sometimes the resentment can always become excessive, and I think the resentment has become excessive, partly because the people who are expressing the resentment now are not the people who ever experienced empire. They're the grandchildren. And there's a lot of them, you asked early on about why colonialism has become such a bad word. Well, it's partly because of the new field of post-colonial studies that Edward Said pioneered. And that assumes that empire is all about exploitation and othering and denigrating non-white peoples. But the interesting thing is, post-colonialists are typically not historians. They study literature, and they thrive on theory that, when it comes into the actual historical data of empire, just doesn't stand up often.
Mm-hmm. So it's an a priori position that they're adopting, it would seem.
Yeah, it often is. It often is.
So I'm conscious of the time, and I do want to leave room for the men to ask questions, but let's kind of bring the discussion right to the present. You obviously see it's really important for us to cherish what is good in our story, in our cultural story. Do you have some thoughts as to perhaps why particularly that's the case now, in light of the alternate regimes that are posturing on the world stage?
Yes. So the book I've written, which will come out in February, it is in a sense primarily addressed to my fellow Britons, but it's also addressed to Australians, New Zealanders, and Canadians, because in a sense, our identity, what we think of ourselves, is bound up with our assessment of our past. Since I think the anti-colonialist litany is in itself so unbalanced as to be untrue, I'm very concerned that my own country doesn't start to design its foreign policy on the basis of that. Partly because it's untrue, partly because I think it would weaken us, and it would weaken Australia. And why does that matter? Because I think the West matters. Now, in the 1990s, when the Cold War ended, and I guess, was it around then that Deng Xiaoping held forth the promise of economic and perhaps political liberalization in China, we thought we could put our swords away, and we, here in Europe, we kind of forgot what NATO was for. And in a sense, we could take the West for granted. We thought we'd reached the end of history. But in the last 5, 7, 10 years, both with regard to China and with regard to Russia, we've learned that no, threats to the liberal world, with all our flaws, and there's lots about the liberal West that deserves criticism, but with all our flaws, our liberal institutions, the rule of law, restraints on the state, free press, the capacity to test orthodoxies within the law are really valuable. And you know, just I imagine if you were to ask many Chinese people in Hong Kong right now, at least behind closed doors, they'd nod their heads. So right now, it's important, since the West is the dominance of the West and the liberal order throughout the world is being threatened by China and by autocratic states in China and Russia. It's really important that the West not lose confidence in itself, even while being self-critical. And if the anti-colonialist story prevails, we will lose confidence in ourselves.
So what needs to change if we're to have a really constructive dialogue about our past and about the good of Western civilization?
Well, I think first of all, we need to remember that this as it were internal discussion about our colonial history, there's a context, folks, and the context is threats from China and Russia. So this is not a, so we need to stop being quite so introverted and narcissistic. This is not just an internal discussion. It's a really important global discussion, and there's a context, and we need to remember that, and therefore we need to remember why it might be important to cherish what is valuable in the West, notwithstanding all that deserves criticism. If there are valuable things in the West, then we need to remember them and cherish them. And then we need, I think, and I guess in my experience of my critics, as I said, has been that they, frankly, I don't find them very intellectually scrupulous. And I think it's hard to know how to address someone who is constantly changing the goalposts and indulging in ad personam provocations and won't give and take reasons. But I think the best thing to do is to keep one's dignity and keep giving reasons, because my conviction is that even if the people in your face, shouting in your face, aren't listening, for every one of them, there are 10,000 other people watching what's going on, and they're the ones we should be addressing. So I think keeping one's dignity, being humble, conceding mistakes, but pushing reasons, even if they're unpopular reasons, is what one has to do. And I am optimistic that in time, reason will prevail.
Thank you, Nigel. I was going to ask if you're optimistic, but it's great to hear that. Look, I could keep asking questions, but I won't. So, gentlemen, a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question, please use the raised hand function, and we'll unmute you and you can address Nigel with your question. Please, if you're here for the first time, don't feel inhibited. Please do feel free to ask your question. I do see some of our regulars diving in straight away, but I would like to see some fresh faces asking questions. So I will prioritize those who haven't asked questions before. So it'd be lovely to hear from you. I might go first to Paul.
Look, thanks so much, Nigel. That's a really, I work in academia. I'm part of a project in Australia to start a Pentecostal Christian university, a thing called Alpha Crucis. But yeah, it deeply worries me, the situation in our public universities in Australia, and particularly for young academics who can't afford to ignore, the career consequences of advocating positions at the conservative end of the political spectrum, and even worse, if they're Christians and are public about their Christian faith. And I just really appreciate any comments that you have on what the situation's like in Britain for younger academics who don't fit who are not with the program. What are the dilemmas there? Are they leading the system? What does that mean for the future of our universities? That's, I know you ended on an optimistic note, but that's something that deeply worries me about what's happening in Australia. And any comments on the situation, particularly for younger academics in our public universities, would be really appreciated.
No, Paul, I appreciate that problem acutely. I've had junior colleagues whisper to me that they approve of what I'm doing and they would love to do the same thing, but they can't afford to. And I say, well, no, you can't afford to, at least not until you get tenure. I have junior colleagues who are of conservative disposition and report that when they apply for jobs, they're required to put on record all they've done to foster anti-racism and so forth. So, okay, so we have that problem here. And of course they have it in the States. And one option is to try and create independent institutions, like the university in Austin, Texas, that's in the process of being set up. And in history of England, of course, there's a long tradition of non-conformist colleges up north that have now become universities, which at the time were set up because non-Anglicans couldn't come to university. So that's one option. I myself regard it as a kind of, it's the last resort. I think in Britain at the moment, there is the possibility of fighting back within current institutions, partly because things are not quite as extreme here as they are in the States. I'm not sure how bad it is in Australia, because we have had people like Louise Richardson defend academic freedom. But also we have going through Parliament right now a government bill that will, I think, strengthen the duty of universities to respect academic freedom. And that really means, in effect, to respect political diversity within the university. And there are moves to try and create various institutions in our universities that will provide a kind of alternative voice, perhaps not part of the university, but as it were on the campus. So I think there are possibilities for infiltrating back. But the fact that the fact that our current government, Lord knows how long it will survive, given the nonsense it's currently created, is on side, gives us a kind of environment of support. But at the moment, I think we can do things within universities to try and turn things around. Partly because, as I say, my conviction is that the majority of colleagues are uncertain and just don't want to get into trouble. And if we can change the environment where they can feel more confident in voicing their doubts, we could see things transformed. But that means changing the environment so they feel more confident. They feel that they can afford to take risks.
We have a question from David.
Nigel, just a quick one. My grandfather used to say to me, thank heavens Australia was colonised by the British, because compared with the many other of the Western European colonisers, they were so soft. Have you done some sort of analysis of the Dutch, the Belgians, the French, the Spanish?
No, I haven't. I mean, it's often said, yes. I mean, yeah, it's certainly said that the Dutch and Indonesia were pretty brutal. The French in Algeria, of course. The Spanish in Latin America. I mean, I think all of those empires, you probably find softer and harder bits of them. But certainly my study of the British Empire is that increasingly evangelical Christianity and Christian humanitarianism dominated central imperial policy. It didn't always work out in the colonies because, of course, colonial governments were more or less autonomous. But there was certainly a very strong Christian humanitarian impulse in the British Empire. But I would hesitate to make blanket comparisons because I just haven't done the homework, really.
Thank you. I think we'll leave that to David's grandfather to make that comparison. Stuart.
Hey, Professor. Good evening to you. Right across the road from the office that Nick and I are here in Sydney, there's a statue of Sir George Grey, whose name would be well known to you. I was amused that during the disorders in mid-2020, where statues were being vandalized all over the empire, that one was left alone. And I attribute it to the ignorance of Australians. They didn't realise that Sir George Grey was such an allegedly bad person. Which brings me to my point. It's not just the academics who don't engage with the history. It's the lay people who have got no idea. Now that must be a challenge to you. Do you ever feel like looking down on all those ignorant people who speak about what they do not know? And how do you then be charitable towards those people?
Well, it's really irritating and it's dismaying how much nonsense is spouted by people who ought to know better or people who really do know better. What's also dismaying is how many people who do know better stay silent. I try not to be uncharitable. I try to concentrate on getting the truth out, and if my book does nothing else, I hope the people who read it will then know all that the British Empire was about. I mean, there are books out there that will tell you. So Neil Ferguson's Empire, published 20 years ago, which I read 20 years ago, I reread recently after writing my book, and it's a good book actually. It's a good balanced book. So there are books out there that will tell you, but people really do need. Well, if they're listening, they need to know how little they know.
A question from Howard.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Nigel. Very stimulating. Nigel, a thought that occurs to me is that for many in my generation, there's an awareness of the sins of the grandfathers of colonialism, and there's awareness of the pain that the grandchildren who were abused or offended by colonialism, that is to some extent unmitigated or unresolved. And so the grandchildren are trying to deal in some way with the sins of the fathers. Do you have any comment on how we as Christians can help those, particularly who might be non-Christian, come to terms with the sins of the fathers?
Yeah, it's possible I'm missing something here, Ross, and so I must be open to correction. But I've heard people in this country talk about the pain they feel about slavery. So Black Britons talking about the pain of slavery, and I have to say, my response is, folks, you weren't enslaved. Now, it may well be that for whatever reason, you as a group, let's say of West Indian Britons, you suffer disadvantage. And I understand your pain at that. So let's tackle the disadvantage and tackle the roots of it, which might be, at least proximately, might be to do with education, might be to do with class or money or whatever it is. But as I was sticking the blame on slavery 2 centuries ago, a hell of a lot's happened between then and now. So I'm more inclined to say I'm skeptical of your claimed pain at the sins of great-grandfathers in the 1840s. And that was a long time ago. And an awful lot's happened since. So let's address the injustice, or at least the the inequalities, insofar as the inequalities are unjust, in the present. Because trying to unpick the past 6-7 generations ago, it's too complicated, and it's too entangled to do that in a rational fashion. But it may be that in saying that, I'm aware that I may come across as being uncompassionate. I'm just a bit skeptical about historic pain.
Howard, have you been able to fix your audio?
Is that better now? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the tip from somebody. And thank you very much for your responses to the questions, Nigel, and your very sensible questions. I have just finished reading Niall Ferguson's book, and I found it a very balanced expose of what happened. And bearing in mind that I grew up in Zimbabwe, so I've got some direct experience from living in Malawi, Zimbabwe, and Australia. I've also just finished reading a book called Cynical Theories, which explores the arguments that you've made in terms of the narrative is that the more often we say something, the more it must be right, and forget about the science. And it explores post-colonialism, post-sexism, post-feminism, a whole bunch of other isms, and concludes the same as you conclude, Nigel. So I suppose it's supporting your views about the world, which I'm very strongly behind. And I was interested in your views about Niall Ferguson. I suspect if he'd written this book today, it wouldn't have got quite the popular acclaim that it got 20 years ago.
No, it is a good book. I mean, as I say, I reread it having done my own research, and actually, I was just saying that as I said, I reread Neil's book after having done my own research and writing, and I think it's a very balanced account. The book on critical, what is it? Critical theories?
Cynical
theories. Yeah, I've read that too. It's really quite helpful. I think at the heart of the posture of a lot of the anti-colonialists, the anti-racists, what you might call unscientifically the wokists, is this view that people like me, white, privileged, nothing I say is to be taken at face value, because I'm simply expressing and defending my own unjust privilege, and that only the views of the victims or the grandchildren of the victims or the advocates of the victims, that's the only truth that matters. Now, I mean, I mean, Peter asked me what we might take positively from the decolonizers, and I take the point that sometimes what one says is a rationalization of one's own advantages, and it may be politically interested, and yes, there are voices that ought to be heard that have been suppressed. I get that, but it's really dangerous when any group presumes that what it thinks and feels is absolute truth, because whether you're at the top or the bottom of a social hierarchy, that is authoritarian. So I get there's a kernel of truth there, but I think it needs critical sifting.
John, if you've got a question.
Yeah. Good evening to you, Nigel, and thank you for your late evening. You mentioned truth as an important factor, and the hostility of a lot of the colonial critiques as being resistant to data. Do you see within a lot of other wokeism, environmental activism, for example, the gender politics, the idea that anyone can decide what gender they are and therefore they must be that gender. A lot of this seems to be anti-Christian, anti-Jewish, and very authoritarian and supportive. And our own dear former Prime Minister Paul Keating was very supportive recently of China. A lot of it seems to be very authoritarian, very supportive of authoritarianism, and very anti-Christian. Is this a cultural thing? Is it a Marxist thing? Is it a spiritual thing? What's the main driver, do you see, coming for this kind of antagonism to the established way of thinking?
I think then it is a spiritual thing, actually. There's I've used the word zealotry. There's a somewhat religious, not in a good sense, religious quality to the anti-colonialist attitude, so that when you say something that they don't like, they don't respond with curiosity. Why would you say that? Why would you think that? What are your reasons? They respond with aggression, because there are certain things they will not hear. And so it does remind me of whether it's a dogmatic authoritarian Marxism, whether it's a dogmatic authoritarian Christian or Muslim. I mean, religion has been authoritarian too. There is the kind of absolute certainty. But for me as a Christian, the absolute self-certainty, the ugly self-righteousness, the unforgiving self-righteousnss is really unattractive. And as a Christian, I understand myself to be a sinner. So I could be wrong. I could be simply voicing my self-interest. It's possible, and I'll take that into account. And that sense of my own sinfulness restrains me from, as it were, casting into outer darkness my critics. But my critics are not so constrained. So in that sense, it is a to me a deeply unchristian, perhaps even anti-Christian spiritual stance.
We're going to have to be super quick, but a question from Dennis.
Nigel, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Can, yep.
Nigel, to what extent did your Christian faith strengthen you during these turbulent times?
Well, a lot, Dennis. I think, as a Christian, I consider my life, the point of my life is, as far as I can, to incarnate in what I say and what I do, what's true, what's good, and what's beautiful, whatever the cost. And of those of us who follow Jesus know that the cost can be one's life. It can be everything, at least in worldly terms. Now that's that view of one's life, that Christian view of one's life, whatever else it does, it dignifies your life with a deep significance. It really matters. And so I think that self-conception, that all I'm about, in the end, all we're about is bearing witness to what's true and what's just. And on the one hand, it can lead you to a place which is very difficult. On the other hand, deeply in one's heart, because it's what you're about, it's actually deeply satisfying.
Mm. Nigel, thank you. Apologies to my co-host Oliver Greaves. We're not going to get to your question, but that was a real high point, I think, to finish our discussion. Thank you, Nigel. I'm going to ask David Pitt from Brisbane if he could say a closing prayer. Before he does so, just very quickly, you will get an email inviting you to give some feedback after today. Please do take time to fill that in. And secondly, we do have small discussion groups in person and online next Friday morning. If you're interested, please do fill in the feedback and let us know. These are a wonderful way to dig deeper in the discussion we've just had, to get to know one another and build, as Oliver said at the start, the fellowship that we enjoy here. So do consider joining one of the small groups if you're not yet part of it. Nigel, thank you so much. David, could you say a short prayer?
Can do. Heavenly Father, thank you for our time together this morning. Thank you for Nigel, that he could join us and share his wisdom and thoughts on these matters, and help us all to think about how we might think about what is true and right and beautiful and good, and help others to do so as well. Amen.
Amen. Nigel, again, thank you so much.
Thank you for the opportunity to meet you virtually and talk about things that are really important to everybody.
Thank you, and have a good evening. We look forward,
Have a
we
good
look forward
morning.
to the book.